Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. We've been taking a few short trips around our hometown of Portsmouth and decided to go back and film a place where we visit quite frequently. Part of one of 5 defensive forts that were built upon the summit of Portsdown Hill in the 1860s, we learn about the variety of guns and anti-aircraft artillery and explore the museum of the Royal Armoury's National Collection of Historic Cannons. Join us for part 1 of our explore at Fort Nelson. As we enter into the fort, we are met with the first point of contact where enemies could be picketed off. The drawbridge and the entrance to the fort rests over a cut ditch that is 40 foot deep and 50 feet wide. The slight hump in the floor of the ditch is a man-made firing step for a later rifle range. This enabled the soldiers to fire over the chalk wall if need be. Fort Nelson had 2 entrances, one on the west and one in front of us. The entrance here had wooden gates and is studded with metal to give greater protection. Impressively, the first thing you'll notice as you wander through is the variety of guns, part of the museum's Voice of the Guns gallery, and it makes for some really interesting reading if you have some time to look through. One of the guns that really stood out was the bombard gun. This beautiful and incredible piece of equipment is the bronze Great Turkish Bombard. This gun was built and ordered by the Sultan in the 1480s and manufactured from Ottoman military engineer Munar Ali, and was cast into 2 pieces, the barrel and the powder chamber, which screwed together. The gun was filled with massive stone cannonballs, as you can see at the end of the gun, and it was the heavy demolition weapon of the Middle Ages. From here there are many different routes to take you around this extensive fort, but we chose to venture outside in the parade ground so we could head into the artillery hall for its artillery exhibition. Heading outside in the typical wet and windy weather for the UK, we're drawn to the replica of a steel armour plate from the 1960s. It was a 140mm thick steel armoured plate that was brought over from the firing ranges in the Wiltshire Plains. This displays the effect of the armour-piercing ammunition that was shot during and after the Second World War to replicate firing at tanks and its impact. Amongst the armour plates there are various numbers of cannons and anti-aircraft guns dotted around the site. We didn't go to every single one because if you get the opportunity to come here, it would be incredible for you to discover the number of guns that they actually have. Because the forts were not used to repel an invasion, and perhaps because it seemed as though the forts pointed the wrong way, their guns actually aimed inland, and they soon became known locally as Palmerston's Follies. You'll notice this when you're walking around the parade ground. The ground was an open area where the troops used to do their training. It would be a place where the soldiers would gather and do their parades. It would also be seen as one of the more dangerous places to be when the fort was under bombardment. But a series of batteries were along the fort, so the soldiers could disperse into these and down separate tunnels that led out into the firing steps and the base of the ramparts. Incredibly, during the summer months, the museum holds live firing demonstrations, which is impressive to see how the guns and the cannons worked. The purpose of Fort Nelson and the other forts that are neighbouring it were dedicated to provide sheer amounts of firepower to deter an enemy attack on Portsmouth from inland, as part of a ring of Victorian artillery forts to guard the naval dockyard against a feared French invasion. All of this incredible work and thought processes were made into making the fort invincible, but it never saw any action against the French, and it now houses one of the finest displays of historical artillery on display for public viewing anywhere in Europe. Fort Nelson was named after the monument nearby the site in memory of Admiral Lord Nelson, marking the testament of England's greatest naval victory at Trafalgar in 1805 and the death of its greatest admiral. Particularly in the UK and at the end of the Crimean War, marked the beginning of many years of military anxieties. So France under Napoleon III built up their naval and military strength. All of these doubts caused Lord Palmerston to set a royal commission together to report off the defences of the United Kingdom, with Portsmouth and its royal dockyard as the paramount priority. Supported by Queen Victoria and her husband Prince Albert, the result of this all meant that the go-ahead of the greatest building works of fortification was to be undertaken. Inside the amazing artillery hall, it's really hard not to notice or mention the biggest gun that was ever manned and used by the Royal Artillery. It was also used in both World Wars. Railway guns were made in many different sizes, and very many of those were built in super heavy calibre. The weight of the guns would be so powerful and heavy that it was virtually impossible to move them by road. This railway howitzer is impressively the remaining railway gun of any size left in this country. There were originally 5 guns made in this 18-inch calibre by 1917 by the Elswick Ordnance Company, and the guns were intended for France, but they were never actually completed in that time. Now the gun has been donated to the Royal Artillery Historical Trust by the MOD, and is now in the gallery for our viewing pleasure. Other guns inside this exhibit are the iron 16-pounder field guns that would have been introduced later in 1873, and a heavier version of the 9-pounder gun that would have been issued to the Royal Horse Artillery. The purpose for these guns were to engage the troops into the open and be able to attack defensive positions, mostly earthwork and trench defences. This particular gun would be pulled by 4 or 6 horses, and normally based in forts because of their sheer power. Other guns include German quick-firing guns and a Russian field gun. There is such a diverse amount of guns here, and the museum has done a fantastic job teaching you all about them. Artillery volunteers were especially important, and without them the extensive Portsmouth fortress could have never been garrisoned. Fort Nelson, along with the other landworks of this huge ring fortress around Portsmouth, was substantially complete by the late 1860s. The demands for the Royal Commission were never fully met, and the threat of invasion evaporated and Fort Nelson and its other neighbours were never actually put to the test. By the time they were nearly finished with it all, France had been invaded and defeated by Prussia. We next walk up the ramparts of the fort. The high earth banks sweep around from east to west in a D-shaped series of gun emplacements and firing steps. This was important for soldiers having great line of sight over the oncoming enemies. Rifled muzzle loading guns would be used for their long-range defence weapons, as they could reach a range of 4,000 yards. Flanking fire from breech-loading guns would have cross-fire with the other guns at adjoining forts at Wallington and Southwark. It was a system that worked well, interlocking fire and made sure that the line of forts on Portsmouth Hill was a deterrent. What I liked about the ramparts was the overview of the parade grounds and getting a sense of scale of the fort and how it might have looked when it was full of soldiers. Our final stop in this part took us down into a tunnel section that leads onto the North Mortar Battery. The battery is generally protected from direct enemy fire, with the mortars firing from under the brick columns, in the centre, bound by double brick walls to strengthen it, and they are the rifle galleries that would have occupied the infantry, who could fire into the ditch and cover the flanks of the structure, or the caponiers as they are known. All of these were connected by tunnels to the barracks area in the rear of the fort. Finishing off the first part of our explore at Fort Nelson, we head into the mortar batteries underneath the ramparts of the fort, where the mighty mortars are waiting. The guns here weighed in at around 4.5 tons, and it would have needed at least 4 men to work and fire one mortar. The guns were meant to be used for secondary defence, and if need be, the 13-inch mortars would be able to drop explosive shells onto their targets and enemies at a range of nearly 3,000 yards. There really is so much more to discover here at the fort, and we hope that you've enjoyed seeing the artillery side. Join us next week for part 2 as we head underground into the tunnels, and we learn about the Falklands War in the museum's temporary exhibit, and how Portsmouth played a big part in the Falklands War, and we see what life was really like for the typical Victorian soldier. So if you've enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit that like button, click the notification bell, and consider subscribing to our Patreon or to the channel if you haven't already. We'd like to say a big thank you to our Patreons for their support, and a big thank you to everyone watching. We'll see you in part 2. Till next time.